You want to know what's going on.
So I know this is serious business here at the MFA, but first things first, are you a curator of provenance or are you a curator of provenance?
I think either one is acceptable. I tend to say provenance because my first job as a provenance researcher, my supervisor said it that way in like the French way, so that's how I tend to say it, but either one is okay.
So what does provenance mean and why is it important?
So provenance is the history of ownership of a work of art from the time it was created until the present. It's like a work of art's biography.
It's such an interesting job. You're like an art historian, but they're called cases, so you're kind of a detective.
Yeah, there's a little bit of detective work when we are trying to uncover clues to an object's past. But it's also really important that we do this research before we bring new acquisitions into the collection. We need to make sure that we are looking at the history of ownership now and making sure that we're not bringing something into the collection that we can't take legal title to or hold legally or ethically. We are looking at a 17th century portrait of a man. We don't know who the sitter is. It's by Frans Hals. Hals was a renowned portraitist. His works were collected even at the time that he was painting. We know that this belonged to Dr. Leon Lilienfeld and his wife Antonia. They lived in Vienna. Dr. Lilienfeld was Jewish. His wife was of Czech origin.
On March the 12th, 1938, without warning, the German armies marched over the Austrian border.
At the time of the Anschluss, at the time that Nazi Germany annexed Austria in March of 1938, the Lilienfelds fled. And they went first to Italy, and Dr. Lilienfeld died of natural causes on their flight. And Mrs. Lilienfeld continued and made her way to Winchester, Massachusetts, which is where she settled. So Mrs. Lilienfeld flees. She settles in Winchester, Massachusetts. Her paintings are left in Vienna, left within the borders of the Third Reich. So in December of 1940, Cajetan Mollmann, one of the leading figures in Nazi art looting, writes to Martin Bormann, who's Hitler's personal secretary, when the Fuhrer was in Vienna, I showed him a painting by Frans Hals from the confiscated Lilienfeld collection, which interested him. So they really wanted this painting. So what I thought was really interesting when I was researching this is why did they have so much interest in this particular painting? Hals was really a renowned portraitist. This is his late style. This is what he did at the very end of his life, and it's much freer brushwork than he did at the beginning of his career. And art historians began to embrace this kind of painterly style of his. And if you think about why, it was about this time that we're seeing the beginnings of Impressionism. You know, Manet did not paint fingernails because Frans Hals did not paint them. Apparently Degas said that. I don't know if it's a real quote, but it is attributed to him. In other words, people started looking to Hals as inspiration. So if you think about who was advising Hitler in the 1930s, they would have been art historians that were trained, at the beginning of the century and would have understood the value in Hals's late style. If provenance is like a work of art's biography, the back of a painting is like its passport. On the back of this painting, there are still Nazi-era stamps, labels, inscriptions. So what happens? In 1944, basically all works of art of high value are evacuated by Nazi forces out to salt mines and other depositories out in the countryside. Mrs. Lilienfeld is here in the United States. She has no idea what's happened to her paintings. So she comes to the MFA and she approaches our curator, W.G. Constable. And she's like, can you help me get my paintings back? I have no idea what happened to them. And W.G. Constable says, yes, in fact, a former student of mine is stationed in Vienna. His name is Andrew Ritchie. And Andrew Ritchie was actually one of the monuments men stationed in Vienna. Eventually, they are located and they are shipped to Mrs. Lilienfeld here at the MFA. She gave us the hulls in 1966 in memory of her husband on the occasion of our centennial.
Why don't we just do this one and then
The history of this painting helps us to understand Nazi-era looting and restitution, but it also shows how, the art object itself, in other words, the attribution, the style, sort of art historical qualities of the painting determine the path that it takes. You really can't extricate the history of the object from the object itself as art object, and that's, I think, this is a perfect illustration of that, I think.
Watch more Art Inc. with new episodes uploaded every Wednesday on ripbs.org/artinc.